6 years ago, when the OECD, UN Environment, GGGI, and ourselves started working together on green growth around and created the Green Growth Knowledge Platform, we had a bit of debate about whether green growth meant green and inclusive growth, or whether we actually had to specify green and inclusive growth. All of us were convinced that what we wanted was something green and inclusive, but it wasn't completely clear at that point whether you really had to specify it. And I think we've all come to agree now that without very active policy, there's no guarantee that green will be inclusive. Poor people suffer the most from environmental degradation, that we know. We also know that they're more dependent than better off people on natural resources. But it doesn't follow from that environmental policies, even good environmental policies, will necessarily be good for them. Part of the reason, of course, is that poor people don't have the luxury of thinking in the long term. They tend to have very short-term horizon, and most environmental policies are designed to pay off in the medium to long term. Not all of them, but many do. So there can be some real trade-offs between green and growth. And the point of this session is really to think through what are these how can we design green policies so that they're not bad for the poor, so that they're inclusive, but also perhaps what other instruments can we bring in to be able to ensure that we can achieve the green objectives without doing so at the expense of inclusiveness and at the expense of the poor.
So just moving on to some of the distributional implications of energy pricing reform. This figure here is showing the burden on different income groups expressed as a percentage of their consumption from carbon pricing. So for the United States and China, carbon pricing is moderately regressive, meaning that the burden relative to annual consumption for income groups, for low-income groups, is larger for low-income groups than for higher income groups. For Canada, carbon pricing is approximately distribution neutral, meaning that the burden relative to consumption is very similar for different income groups, whereas in India, carbon pricing is moderately progressive, meaning that the burden relative to consumption is somewhat smaller for lower income groups than higher income groups. And that's, in the case of India, is reflecting the relatively limited vehicle ownership and access to the power grid amongst low income households. This figure here is summarizing the quite substantial body of empirical evidence on the burden of energy price reform and how it's allocated across different income groups for countries in Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, where energy pricing reform here refers to aligning fuel prices with supply costs for petroleum products and natural gas. So in terms of the average impact across all of these fuels, the bottom income quintile bears only a relatively small fraction of the total burden, typically well below 10%. In contrast, the top income quintile bears about 50% of the burden of energy pricing reform. But if we dig deeper into the individual fuels, there's a somewhat different pattern. If we just increased gasoline prices, then the share of the total burden borne by the bottom income quintile is even smaller, less than 5%. Whereas if we just increase kerosene prices, then it's more substantial. About 20% of the burden of higher kerosene prices would be borne by the bottom income quintile. Nonetheless, our basic conclusion from this sort of evidence is that distributional concerns shouldn't hold up energy pricing reform because the huge bulk of the burden is borne by better off households rather than poor households. Nonetheless, it is important to compensate low-income households, and we need to carefully design compensation packages, and the appropriate package of measures will vary with country circumstances. But for example, building off existing benefit and fiscal provisions can help to minimize the administrative costs of compensating the poor, focusing on measures which are carefully targeted at the poor, will help to contain the fiscal costs of the compensation package. Ideally, some of the measures might include those that help to enhance economic efficiency by, for example, promoting labour force participation, lowering taxes for workers, low-income workers in the labour force. And probably we want to avoid measures that might undermine the reduction in energy use, such as subsidies for low-income consumption of energy.
Nobody should have to choose between heating, cooling, or eating, and that should apply right across the world. And why we fought so hard for that extra 0.5% in energy efficiency is that for every 1% increase in energy efficiency, 3 million homes can be properly renovated and 7 million people lifted out of energy poverty. And to come to some of the points, I know we'll discuss them later, but in terms of the Energy Poverty Manifesto, you know, consumers should automatically be put on the cheapest tariff for them. It's social justice. You know, the right to energy. Energy is not a commodity. Energy is a basic social right. Keeping your family cool or warm, heating your food, not a commodity, a basic social right. But one aspect of the clean energy package that we're absolutely committed to is what we're calling just transition. We are asking communities and industries to change. You cannot afford to leave those communities and those workers behind. When we had mass deindustrialization in Europe in the 70s and 80s, we closed car factories, we made people redundant, those communities imploded, the supply and distribution chains imploded, local shops did, and people were out without the dignity of work. That happened because economically we intervened in those industries and in those communities when the industries had died and not before. So what we're asking for in Just Transition is that we upskill and reskill workers now for the green jobs of the future. We don't wait till we close the pits. We actually work with those workers now. We upskill and reskill them. But more than that, we know, and our academics around this table know, the industries that are emerging of the future, digitalization, artificial intelligence, green, sustainable jobs. We need to be equipping our 3-year-old girls now with the educational pathways to access the high GDP job of the future. So now you will hear the Parliament talking about energy poverty. It is now enshrined in EU law for the first time, I'm proud to say. But you will also hear us talk about a just transition for workers. We cannot afford, morally or economically, in the just transition to a green economy, to leave any worker or any member of their family behind.
The just transitions for us, speaking for, say, developing countries, African countries with whom I work with more closely. Today, we have more than 600 million people in Africa that will not be in that sample for this study that was done by the IMF because they don't have access to electricity. Yeah. And from this study, you are saying also the case of India, the impact is less on the poor because they were not in your sample. It's not because the impacts are less. It's simply because they are not there. So how do we design this transition so that it becomes just? Because what has happened in the first industrial revolution, second industrial revolution, third industrial revolution, is that the poor are not on the table. And because they are not there, we design policies with belief from all good intents and purposes, from all good analysis, is good for them. But in the end, what we have seen in all these industrial revolutions is that we're not right. And the social disparities are increasing. Social inclusion is still a topic in conference rooms, but not really happening. So my real passion discussing green transitions for many years now is how do we ensure that this transition is different from the other transitions that has happened before? Because we are still using the same methodologies, we're applying the same market principles, the same institutional thinking, the same economic models. All the things that we used to define how the other transitions happened are still the things we are using now. It's just the subjects have changed. So how do we ensure that there is a safety net for those who are not included in the sample of in the population of our study and these discussions, so that we can create social safety nets to ensure that they are not left behind, which is the objective of Sustainable Development Goals. And for me, the first thing we need to do, because the question Marian has asked me, is to talk about how we can implement these policies to make sure that it is inclusive. Can we try to make sure that the labor market of the future is changed by the skills of the future, not by the policies of the future? Because we can create policies, we can create all these things, but if we continue to leave the major group of people in the developing world not as participants, it will never be pro-poor and it will never be inclusive. And Marianne, you remember at the beginning of the discussions on this, I kept saying my interest is in the inclusion. Because if we create a green economy that is not inclusive of the economic imperatives or the social issues around it, we are just creating another economy that is going to collapse in future. So how we make it inclusive is very, very important. Second, for countries, when they make policies on green growth, climate change, or anything, I would like to see that those policies are thought of through the lens of the development agenda of that country. So how do we make sure that we're pursuing our development goals in a climate resilient way, not pursuing climate change goals in a development resilient way? It's a different kind of thinking. How do we approach these policies to ensure that it's socially inclusive? So from the beginning, from setting the agenda, from doing the study, that beautiful study that IMF has done for us, that all these objective functions are put in the optimization that we want to do. Because if we move to optimizing on environmental goals, we make the same mistakes that we've made when we optimized on the economic goals alone. So can we create such models, such thinking, such policies that are really comprehensive?
The natural water, the raw water, is preserved in terms of quality and quantity. And the way to do that, I will not elaborate on that, is by building partnerships between the dense urban centers that use the resource and the less dense, less well-off in general, far away from the new green growth and digital growth, territories where we take the water from. And that comes by forging an alliance, especially with the agricultural sector. And those who know France know that getting together water sector and getting together with the farmers is a challenge. So my 3 key points would be you need to find compromises, as Theresa would say in the European Parliament, between what is technical, the cost, and what is political, the price. That's also a matter of collective choice. You need to play with timescales and geographical scales. You can't solve paradoxes like this one only if you look right where you are and right when you are. And the last lesson I would draw is you also need to include, and I refer to what Ian was saying in the beginning, a compensation for some cost. And for example, in the alliance we build with the farmers, we compensate for them the cost of turning their agricultural practices into green practices.
What does this mean for households? Electricity prices for low volume users have gone up by over 268%, and around 80% for very high volume users. So depending on where you sit in your consumption. A small apartment, a monthly bill in summer might be now around $200 US. For a large villa, you might have around $450 a month in summer when you're using peak air conditioning. So this is really a fundamental shift in how consumers are being asked to pay for something before, which was almost free. Part of the story here is that these are very new changes. And I looked at the price for gasoline in Ian's presentation on around 25 cents per litre in Saudi Arabia. It's actually now around 56 cents per litre. So you've had a doubling more than since 2016. Actually, the price went up by 240% and a doubling just in the last year or so. So the pace of these changes is incredibly fast. And people are being asked to absorb this shift in social contract at the same time as a wide range of other reforms that are impacting on the cost of living. And so the government's essentially brought in two ways to offset this impact on household. One is by establishing what has called a citizen account, and 11 payments have been made through this citizen account. 12.3 million people have subscribed. 84% of the people who applied were accepted. So far, around $6.7 billion has been distributed under this program. And this is direct cash payments at the household level. And so individuals are grouped into a household, and the payment is made means tested at the household level. So obviously the lower income households will receive a much greater proportion than the higher income households. The average payment per month is around 1,000 riyals, which is just a touch over around $300 per month.
How do we get public support for the transition? And I'd like here to give an example or something that we worry about in the development policy world in infrastructure, where, my colleagues who work on water in developing countries tell me nobody has ever said that telephones are a human right. And as a result, today, you have many more cell phones, people who have cell phones, than people who have toilets or access to clean water. And they warn of the danger of calling anything a human right, because they say, as a result, consumers don't want to pay for it, and you're not subjecting this to commercial principles. And if you don't subject a service to commercial principles, it becomes very difficult to provide it in an efficient, cost-effective, and sustainable way. And the result typically is the one who don't get the service are the poorest. So at the same time, I think, Nicola was talking about the need to essentially buy public support for a transition, right? So you've got these kind of two extremes, right? One where you say, well, it is just to give people access to what I think all of us would agree are the basic necessities of life. You do have to buy off people, even the ones that are not particularly poor, because you need their support. But how do you, maybe Saudi Arabia can afford it, but what about the rest of us? And how do we make sure that we develop a transition that is politically inclusive, meaning gets public support, not of the poor, of course, but also of those who have the power to block it? I wonder if any of you care to pick up on this.
Start very quickly with two lines of answer to that. The first one is, in some cases, it is possible to show that green growth is actually a good way to make services more affordable. So I come back to what we're trying to do by protecting the water quality at the stem, at the spring of it. If we manage it in the long run, it's in 25, 30, 50 years, we will be able to withdraw some of the treatment processes that we're actually using and that are very expensive. So maybe water is going to be cheaper in 30 years if we actually implement with consistency green growth approaches to production of water. And second thing is also showing that managing services in a more sustainable way is also contributing to sustainable policies that people actually see. People don't see the quality of raw water in the underground resources. They see that the landscape that we are managing sustainably in the surface are beautiful to see. And they also contribute to the quality of life and the quality of the living environment for lots of people. That's one answer.
If I add a little bit on this, I think the first thing, Marianne, is that communication is key. How we communicate a policy, a transition, defines how people respond to it. I take an example of climate change. When we started trying to get African leaders to key into climate change, what we did was to create a narrative that this is about development first. So we had a climate for development conferences that were run out of the UNECA, the Africa Climate Policy Center at that time, led by Yoba Sokona. And the whole idea was framing for them the positive opportunities on climate change, the innovation opportunities on climate change, the areas how climate change will help improve livelihoods, improve GDP, and so on. And also the potential issues of no action. If you decided to do nothing about it, because some policymakers maybe thought, oh, this is something, a policy for Europe. They have achieved poverty eradication and something, and then they can talk about climate, and so on and so forth. So that issue of making sure that from the onset, the objective function is what the government wants, is what the people want, is very critical. Because in the real sense, water, for example, I did some many years ago, willingness to pay studies on water in many African countries, Ghana, Kenya, and so on. And you find that the poor pay exorbitantly higher than the rich for water. And they're buying bad water from tankers and so on. And then, so I did a willingness to pay study and also included a revealed preference study. So your actual payments and what you are willing to pay. On average, households were willing to pay about $5 for water. But in recent, they were spending $300, $400 for water. So you confront them with the data. Hey, this is what you're already doing. And this is what you want to do. Why is there this gap? And then the uptake of pipe-borne water and so on in households was very fast. Because they can see we're trying to solve your problem. We're not telling you this is good for you, therefore if you don't do it, one thing or the other happens. And that's my great worry about how we're approaching the COP21 agreement currently, especially in the energy sector. Because when we present it is either or, if you do this, we won't fund any coal power plant. It becomes something done from outside. But if you actually can get the governments to understand the huge opportunities in renewables, which are huge, and huge opportunities in the transitioning because you are positioning yourself for the markets of the future, the dialogue changes and the acceptability of these policies change. But that doesn't take away the fact that whichever way we communicate it, any transition takes time. So it has to be gradual. So we don't have to say, we've had disagreement in Paris, and therefore it starts now. So it has to be a gradual process because human behavior, we change very gradually. Even when we know that resource efficiency is good, we don't always do it. Even with all the beautiful policies we have in Europe on that, not all European countries really follow resource efficiency to the letter. So for me, communication, key. Second, framing, how we frame that communication is the second thing. Third, what's the objective function? If the objective function is to do what I really want to do, which is every government in Africa wants to alleviate poverty. It wants to grow the economy. It wants to create infrastructure. So let's present the green transition in helping them to do this and build markets for the future. That will be much better than creating it as an environmental activism tone of this is good for the environment and you have to do it.
Thank you, Marianne. It's got to be communicated in ways that touches people's everyday lives. I don't know if anybody here has ever been to Blackpool. Yes, hurrah. Blackpool is a seaside town in my region, and it's very economically poor. And there's something in this which is about scale and local ownership, and also about having the faith for long-term R&D. R&D is crucial in this. It can't just be about things that can improve capitalisation. So 15 years ago, the European Investment Bank invested in Lancashire waterways, and there was an outcry. Why is European money going? What is this? You know, blah, 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 blah. Now Blackpool, because of that investment, has got blue flag status as a beach, which means that local families can actually go and the kids can swim in the sea, and there's a real sense of ownership, and now they begin to understand that there is a connection between the two. I think you're absolutely right about affordability, and we know through the work that we've done with NGOs, with stakeholders, with business and with banks, that in terms of energy efficiency will actually mean that people will end up with lower bills, so it affects their pocket. This is an issue that brings it. Jobs. I represented one of the poorest wards in Liverpool when I was a local councillor. The right to have a job that actually earns enough money to keep your family. And if that is in the green transition and we've upskilled and reskilled or educated that girl to get that job, and it's in that economy, then those people will naturally become advocates for that economy. In the governance of the Clean Energy Package for All, we deliberately wrote in local authorities and cities because we think this cannot be achieved just at a member state level. It's got to be at a local level too. We've written in consultation that we hope is effective. We've written in that there should be local panels made up of local people, that we need trusted information points such as citizens' advice bureaus, etc., etc., etc. Achieving this is a real hard job. You know, we can write the legislation, but actually it happening on the ground. But there's a really good example, if anybody wants to look, which is Manchester, which Manchester has actually said it will be carbon neutral by 2050. But it has had real stakeholder engagement, including, for instance, doing projects in schools that those kids then take home, that their parents are involved with, about all of this stuff. So and there are citizens panels in terms of the ownership of the board for Manchester Energy Company. It involves local people that are elected, etc., etc., etc. If we do nothing, gosh, Kevin, if we think we've seen a refuge crisis so far, just wait until 100 million people in the developing world have been displaced from their homes by 2050. Thanks to the effects of climate change. We cannot do nothing. And finally, health. When we were talking about renewables and the switch from fossil fuels to renewables with colleagues in Eastern and Central Europe, and you know, we have high-paid jobs in those industries, and we have whole communities that are dependent upon those jobs. What really began to swing the argument was when health studies were done, which actually showed that there was increased childhood asthma in Poland because of, sorry, I've said it, in Poland, Bulgaria and the Czech Republic and everywhere else, because of burning fossil fuels. Because when you start to think about your child or your grandchild, it actually comes home to you.